Let's dive into the background leading up to this album. Now, it is important to note, as we talked about before, this is the fifth studio album by The Who, and it is following up their ambitious and smash hit double album Tommy that came out in 1969. Now, Tommy is also on the list, so we're not going to go too in depth on Tommy or anything like that, but I do think that the backdrop of understanding that they're going in to try to make an album to follow up Tommy is important to the story of why they made some of the decisions that they did leading up to the creation of this album. But first, we're going to jump back and just talk about the history of The Who. Now, again, they have some more albums on here, so we're not going to have this be exhaustive, but we're going to try to get through just some background so that you can understand what's going on. So they started out basically in West London. They all went to the same grade school together. Roger Daltrey and John Entwistle Pete Townsend and John Entwistle were friends, and they both formed a little jazz group together, primarily interested in playing rock and roll music, but they were playing in the school band. And so Entwistle was playing the French horn, for Christ's sake, pretty far away from rock and roll, but eventually decides like, hey, maybe I should play the guitar. And Entwistle and Townsend are kind of playing together. Entwistle's on guitar, Townsend's on guitar. Entwistle realizes that his hands are too damn big to play the guitar. And so he decides that he wants to become a bass player. And he didn't have the money to buy a bass, so he built one himself at home, which is bizarre to me that was somehow cheaper to do than just buy a bass. Like, I feel like even nowadays with all the parts caster kits and shit like that, you just go buy a Squire for $89. It's gonna be the cheapest thing you can do,
Yeah,
right?
what did he have access to at home that I'm not aware of?
Oh, his
Well,
dad started Radio Shack.
well, Acton was a like manufacturing town, so there was a lot of like blue collar and sort of like middle class, upper middle class manufacturing jobs around there. So I don't know, maybe his dad did have like a lathe in the fucking
He
garage
must
or
have had
something.
something, man. You can't just
Yeah,
embark on that project with a saw.
yeah, seriously. All right, so Entwistle and Townsend, they're playing together a little bit, nothing too serious. At this point, into the story struts Roger Daltrey. Now, Daltrey was a year older than them and had been expelled from school at the age of 15 and decided that he was going to get a job at a construction site in the area. And so it's like, no, I'm not going to try to go back to school. I'm 15 years old. It's about time I become a man and start
Jeez.
earning a paycheck with manual labor. But he did have ambitions to become a rock star, and he forms a band called the Detours in 1959. In 1961, a couple of years after the Detours are already playing, he sees Entwistle walking down the street with his homemade bass. And he's like, hey, man, I remember you from school. Why don't you come on and join my band? And at this time, Daltrey is the guitar player in the band. The vocals are being handled by a guy named Colin Dawson. Harry Wilson is on drums. And so Entwistle says, great, I'll come join your band. They're a cover band, basically playing around the local scene in West London. They're getting gigs. It's nothing big. But important to kind of later Who dynamics is that Daltrey is the band leader. He's a little older than the other guys, and he's also the one trying to make it into a career. So he's like watching the money. He's like really the one who is invested in pushing this band forward. So Entwistle jumps on in 1961. In late 1961, he says, hey, we should recruit Pete Townsend. I know him. He's a great guitar player. We had jammed together before. Pete joins the band as the second guitar player. They fire drummer Harry Wilson, replace him with a guy named Doug Sandholm, who is credited in Wikipedia as an English bricklayer who was the first drummer for The Who.
Nice.
So, yeah, like not a lot of career trajectory after leaving The Who.
Knowing nothing about the origin story of this band, I wouldn't have guessed that Daltrey was the one who put it together.
Right? That's what I'm
Yeah, I'm
saying.
kind of
He actually
surprised.
was
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
the
I thought he was like a dopey like underwear model or something that they just we're like, oh, the three of us are too ugly. We need like a good looking guy to
yeah, the
jump on
studio
board.
pawned him off on. They're like, all
Let's
right.
get Daltrey. He looks good with his shirt off. You know.
Yeah.
Townsend
Yeah.
is pretty goofy looking, let's be honest.
Hey, listen, all of us big nose guys take offense to that characterization, Rob.
Yeah, we do.
All right. So Colin Dawson leaves the band after arguing constantly with Daltrey. They get another vocalist, but pretty soon Daltrey throws that guy out. And he says, you know what? I'm going to take over as the lead vocalist and leader of the band. That leaves Pete Townsend as the sole guitar player. Now, they haven't really developed a distinct sound. So they're kind of copying more successful acts, and they're mostly playing American R&B covers, James Brown, Bo Diddley, Howlin' Wolf, stuff like that. And they want to, again, take it a little bit more seriously. And it just so happens that both of Pete Townsend's parents were musicians. His dad is a sax player, and his mom had actually sung in army bands during World War II. So she had some knowledge of the music industry. And in 1962, she ends up getting them management representation through some of her connections in the industry. And that leads to them basically being booked as the opener for larger bands in the West London area.
Quick question: did his dad make the sax himself?
He made it out of an old English gourd. So they are still called the Detours at this point, but they soon learn that there is another band called Johnny Devlin and the Detours, and they decide that they need to change their name. So, like a lot of young bands, they get a ton of names that they like, kind of bounce back between a few, and then eventually they settle on The Who in 1964.
I know we've spoken about it before, but could you imagine a time when The Who was still on the table as an untaken band name?
Seriously. And they had like the other ones were like The Hair. It was like, also, then that's a much worse name.
I think they were the High Numbers for a little while as well.
Well, so that's actually coming up, and that's a very interesting part of the story. So they get a new manager. That manager immediately clashes with their drummer, Doug Sanholm. And this causes Doug to leave the band, basically storm off. But he permits the band to continue to use his drum kit while they search for a permanent drummer. Damn. And they're casting about for a new drummer, playing some gigs with the stand-in drummer, and they meet Keith Moon, who is playing drums in a band they end up playing with called the Beachcombers. And Keith says, hey, man, the Beachcombers aren't taking this too seriously. I know you guys are pretty serious. Why don't you let me sit in on a few songs with you guys and see if I fit in as the drummer? And over the course of the 4 songs that he plays with them, he breaks the kick drum pedal and rips a drum head. And they're like, you're in the fucking band. That's amazing. But
I love that because I feel like Keith Moon is someone that probably never had a proper drum lesson. You hear about all these other 60s and 70s drummers. They did marching band or they played, went to jazz school. But Keith Moon looks like he just like watched Sesame Street and I
was gonna say I think he really probably is the prototype for Animal. Right?
Yeah. I think he actually was the prototype for Animal. Right. And, Marty, as a drummer, like really good drummers are going to play with their wrist, and like kind of bad drummers are going to play from the elbow, and really shitty drummers are going to play from the shoulder. Keith Moon plays from like the waist. Like he puts his whole body in every single hit.
He's very unorthodox, and it's just so intriguing to me.
Yeah, we talked about Zeppelin before. I kind of compare him to John Bonham. Like they just beat the shit out of the drums, but they do it in such a way. They just played so much and they're so locked in on what they're doing that it develops this really cool sound that any drum teacher would tell you was a terrible technique.
And he played a lot of shows with no hi-hat, which is like, a standard, cymbal setup for every drummer. He didn't have one. He had he had 2 bass drums.
I wouldn't even understand how to play.
Probably was the first person to have 2 bass drums.
Yeah.
Now it's,
Probably because he was like, well, I'm going to break one of these kick pedals at least at one point during this show. I got to have a backup there. All right. You know what? I think that this is actually a pretty good point to jump into our favorite segment, By the Numbers. Now, the first number that I'm going to throw out is 700,000. That is the estimated number of people that The Who performed in front of at the Isle of Wight Festival in August 1970, about 6 months before the band went into the studio to record this album. So
at one time,
they were
like
riding
the biggest. Is that the biggest? I mean, I can't think of any event.
I looked it up today, actually. Who has the largest event of all time? It was in Moscow. It was
Metallica, right?
No. The Metallica one was 1.6 million.
Oh, geez.
I believe it was Jean-Michel Jarre, played
Oh,
in
yeah.
front of like 3.8 million people in Moscow.
No
Oxygen.
way. What year was that? Do you remember?
It was like the 1980s. I think it was
Wow.
yeah. Um,
That's a James classic there. Jean-Michel Jarre.
yeah. So I mean, it's honestly, I
It's on the
can't
list.
imagine why. Oh, is yeah,
Yeah.
oxygen. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, nice.
how do you get music to reach that many people at once? I mean,
I
it's like a
mean, you
city.
don't.
It's
That's
like a
crazy.
it's a big
I,
city.
I thought it was the California Speedway thing from what is it, 73, 74. I knew that was a large festival. I think 600,000 or something, but I didn't realize it was that big, that it got much, much bigger than that.
Maybe it's because ambient music doesn't change tonally that much, so it can go across a huge field of people more
Yeah.
readily.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
And also
I
maybe
but
they
the
were
but
just
the
drunk.
but the number that you threw that out for a reason. It's the Baba O'Reilly it's the Baba O'Reilly inspiration, isn't it?
Uh, I didn't throw it out for that reason. I threw it out for a nice contrasting next number. But if you want to get into the Bob O'Reilly reason, that's great.
So Teenage Wasteland is Pete Townsend looking out over the Isle of Wight and seeing all these wasted hippies, and it wasn't meant like party on. I mean, there'd be lighter flicking when the Who would sing that song, but he meant it as a condemnation of
It's like
all
a
you
like a
wasted
yeah, like
piece
the
of
Frank
shit hippies.
the,
Yeah,
the Frank Zappa approach.
Yeah,
Exactly.
because he was straight edge
Exactly.
at this point, right?
Well, yeah, not quite. He was more of a drinker, I
Yeah, he
think.
was drinking a lot.
Yeah.
So the next number that I wanted to throw out, in contrast to the 700,000, is 600,000, as in 600,000 pounds, which is apparently after the release of Live from Leeds in 1970 and Who's Next in 1971, both of which were top 5 albums in the US and the UK. Roger Daltrey's accountant was pleased to inform him that he was only 600,000 pounds in debt at that point.
Jeez,
Yes.
that's a lot of hairspray.
Yes.
Right.
And
It's lot
a
of
big part of the
steroids.
reason was the next number, 47 pounds 35 pence. That is the profit that the Who made from their 1975 UK tour.
Damn.
Primarily because they had to continually replace the equipment that they smashed every show,
Ugh.
and owing to the fact that Keith Moon destroyed every hotel room that he stayed in the entirety of the tour. And Roger Daltrey would talk about it. He said, I didn't have any publishing rights on any of the hits. Only Pete Townsend had the publishing rights on our profitable songs. We'd go on tour and the band would lose money and I would be in debt from going on tour because Keith Moon would fucking destroy everything. He talked about going on tour with them where he limited himself to eating 1 hamburger a day. That's all that he would eat because he didn't want to spend any money. And he came back and went to the accountant and said, hey, can I get my cut? And he's like, you owe money. Do you have any idea how much money Keith Moon cost you on this tour, destroying all of the equipment and all of the hotel rooms everywhere that you guys went?
Yeah, but think about the stories, man. There's so many good stories.
That is so dumb, and
That
I
is
must be from
really
a
dumb.
different generation because I've never thought that was cool, even for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he would also dress up like Hitler and, stuff that even then wasn't funny or cool.
Wait, who would do that?
Keith Moon.
Oh, Keith Moon. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was a little bit of a wild man.
He was
We're not gonna get too
he
much
was
into it.
very spectrumy.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
So the next number, just for a little context, is the number 34. And that is the number of albums just from 1971 on the list of 1001 albums to hear before you die. Second only to 1969, which has 37. And then, sorry, go ahead.
I think going to say that was the age that Keith Moon died, but
No, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
The next number is 5, which is the number of albums by The Who on this list. And that, I'm sorry, seems excessive to me. 5 Who albums. Dave, you might say that I'm crazy here.
That
and
must be
absolutely
excessive.
deserve it.
It just objectively must be excessive.
Yes.
No fucking way.
Yeah, I can't.
I
buy
can
that.
I can think of 3 for sure, but maybe not 5.
Yeah. And so The last number we're going to throw out, and it's a bit of a sad number, it is 32. And that is both the age at which Keith Moon died and also the number of alcohol detox pills found in his stomach during his autopsy. 6 of them had been digested, which was already enough to kill him. And he had an additional 26 pills in there. Now, I don't think anybody has ever said that he intentionally overdosed on these because he was trying to get sober. But the direction from his doctor was take one of these when you feel the urge to drink. And he said, don't take more than 3 in a day. And he had 32 in his system when he died at the age of 32, which is really sad, super terrible overall. He had been really falling apart, gaining a lot of weight. A lot of what they blamed it on was the band was taking a break and he didn't have that focus to keep him not from going off the rails. He didn't even have a drum kit at his house. He never played anymore when they were on break. And he's kind of sat around and drank all the time. And so a terrible early end to, I think, somebody that we can all say was, when it comes to drumming and destruction of property, a visionary ahead of his time.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Let's hop back in to our story here. So,
by the way, I love that you introduced that as a sort of perfunctory overview of the band and then started back in the 1830s.
Oh man, I'm trying to move through this, but there's a lot of information on this band. Right? So they have their full lineup now. We just, we're gonna get back into the story. They just got rid of their old drummer. They got Keith Moon on the drums. So they got Daltrey on vocals, Pete Townsend on guitar, John Entwistle on bass, Keith Moon on drums. But they're still kind of casting about for a sound and a look that will help them get a real audience and kind of help them stand out from the crowd. And the inspiration comes in the form of yet another new manager named Pete Meaden. Pete Meaden comes in and he says, I got the exact fit you're looking for. You guys are going to become mods. And they were not mods before, but mod subculture was kind of a uniquely British subculture. It's focused on like young, attractive people, smartly dressed, listening to jazz music, people who are like wearing sunglasses indoors and dressing in suits and riding Vespas and eating speed and listening to John Coltrane all night and shit like that. Now, it's a small subculture, and kind of by the mid 60s, it was already sort of waning in popularity, but it didn't have a real musical standard bearer. And Meaden basically is like a marketing gimmick, thinks I can make you guys the face and the voice of the mods. So I'm going to make you guys mods. He gets them the right haircuts, he gets them the right kind of clothes, and he gets them the right gigs. And basically, he immerses them in mod culture and orchestrates this takeover by The Who. Now, it's often said that The Who were a band that became mods, whereas the other big mod band, Small Faces, were mods that became a band. They were more actually authentically mod. And The Who sort of were just like, our manager saw an opportunity. Now, Townsend had an art school background, so he fucking loves this. He gets way more highfalutin, as we'd say in the States, and jumps into being a mod with both feet. But to better become the voice of the mods, Pete Meaden insists that they change their name from The Who to The High Numbers because that's more modish. I don't understand why. One of the best fucking names of all time. He's like, no, you should become what sounds like a shitty 2002 indie band or something like that.
It does.
So they become The High Numbers. Pete Meaden writes them a single and says, this is the one that you're going to record as the single. I got you a contract. It's a blatant ripoff of like a Slim Harper song and a song by The Showman. It's called I'm the Face. And despite being manufactured exclusively to appeal to mods, it does not catch on. They don't get a chance to record another single. But as fate would have it, and this really does change the overall fate of the band, they happen to be playing a show in the fall of 1964 that is attended by 2 young filmmakers named Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp. Lambert and Stamp were trying to find a band to make a film about, and they really liked what they saw. They liked the high numbers. And not only did they want to make a movie about the band, but they wanted to take over their management. The only problem was they were already being managed by Pete Meaden. So Lambert and Stamp put together this master plan. They scrape up $5,000, which is the equivalent of $50,000 in today's money, and say, we're going to buy out the contract of The Who for $5,000. They take Pete Meaden out to lunch, and they're like, all right, we're going to start off low. How about $500? And Pete Meaden says, fucking sold. There you go. Gets a contract for $500 and walks away. Probably one of the dumbest financial decisions of all time, considering that The Who have sold like 150 million albums over the course of their career. But Lambert and Stamp, smart guys. First thing they do, they say, hey, you should probably change your name back to The Who. It's like way better than the high numbers. And they do. They start playing some shows. And at one of their early shows, Pete Townsend, in an attempt to do a kind of flamboyant guitar move, smacks his guitar against, I think it was the amp, accidentally, and breaks it. And the crowd goes fucking nuts. And he just kind of cracks it, and the crowd's like, whoa, crazy. And so he's like, all right, well, I better lean into this. And he starts fucking bashing the guitar. And Keith Moon's like, that seems like a great fucking idea. And he starts smashing his drums. And thus a trope was born. And they start smashing their equipment regularly, to the point where people were disappointed if they didn't smash their shit at a show that they saw. They kind of felt like they were locked into smashing their shit every single time they went out.
That really is the problem with that gimmick.
It really is. Well, here's the different problem. You put yourself in quite a pickle, because a lot of time that's backline equipment that is owned by the venue, and you're smashing 8-10-year-old fucking equipment, and they're charging you for replacement top of the line shit. Because like, what are you gonna do? You've already broken their backline. And they're like, I got bands tomorrow. I need to go out and buy new shit. You have to pay me for brand new stuff.
I think
too bad Alan's not on this episode, because he has a funny story about this like reggae band backlining his bass and breaking it, and the guy saying, I usually request Ampeg.
That was his explanation for blowing out the bass.
Yeah, for blowing out the Fender bass amp. Yeah.
I actually wonder if you have any intel on this, Tom. Did they at some point, in a business savvy way, like, you'd get to a point, if I were in this band, where I'd be suggesting we buy really crappy instruments at bulk.
You walk off stage and bring in, like, have John Entwistle make some fake instruments.
Yeah.
Or
you have like your nice shit, and then right before you play the last song, you swap it out for the super cheap shit.
Exactly.
And start smashing that stuff. But
right.
They were not financially savvy. It's actually pretty ridiculous when you think about how successful they were and how in debt they were for a significant portion of their career.
Exactly. And how many like 60s, Rickenbacker basses were destroyed, and what would the value be today?
Oh yeah, absolute
millions of dollars.
Absolute gems, classic instruments that I kind of get the sense that Entwistle was not also smashing his shit with reckless abandon the way that Pete Townsend and Keith Moon were. But yeah, he got into it. He actually said that one of the big instigators of the destruction of the hotel rooms was apparently Keith Moon bought a box of 500 cherry bombs and then realized that cherry bombs could explode a toilet if you put them in it, and then started thinking that the explosion from a cherry bomb wasn't big enough. And so he started getting like quarter sticks of dynamite, and then he got half sticks of dynamite, and he was like, and Entwistle was like, yeah, I mean, it was really stupid, but if I'm being honest, I was pretty much there with him all the time, holding matches whenever he was doing it.
Meanwhile, Daltrey is destroying his tambourine.
No, meanwhile, Daltrey is like, trying to pull out pocket change to buy ramen and stuff. Like, we got to be financially prudent.
He's like, I don't even own any of these instruments. Why am I in debt?
Yeah, right.
Why am I paying for Pete's guitar?
I think that also shows a lack of showmanship savvy too, because I feel like I remember Hendrix, he lit the guitar on fire at Monterey. I think he might have done it a couple more times. He definitely didn't do it at every show.
No, he didn't. It was like 2 or 3 times total.
But he was influenced by Pete Townsend, right? Isn't that how the story goes? That he saw The Who break their instruments? And was
They
like,
were
oh,
the first people to smash their instruments, but again, I think I'm with Rob on this one. The problem was that they just did it every time. You
yeah,
know, people were like, is Hendrix going to light his guitar on fire tonight? You know, he did it once, maybe he'll do it. Whereas people with the Who were like, well, they're gonna smash their instruments. They need to. Otherwise, like, what the
Right.
fuck am I even doing here, right?
Yeah, and they were the only band that was really relied upon to do that kind of shit.
Yeah.
And
And it's
it's sad for them because you would think that they didn't have the goods to back up. You know, they had the songs, they had the musicianship, they had the stage presence. It's sad to to think that they felt they needed to, you know, to give in to that.
right. It's not. Yeah,
yeah.
it's not like they're Guar or something where like
Right, right.
they're not. You know, they're just like shooting piss and blood
Yeah.
everywhere. You know.
Yeah.
But to their credit, this did get them a rep. And honestly, being a great, energetic band got them a rep. And that was part of it. And it attracts the attention of Shel Talmy, the guy who had previously produced the Kinks. He likes what he sees. He negotiates a deal with American Decca Records, which is the forerunner of MCA, to make an album. And frankly, this sounds like one of those like super shady like record insider deals where he specifically signs with an American label and then retains the UK distribution rights for himself so that he can make like a shitload of money off the catalog. So typical super shady 60s record labels shit going on there. But it gets them to record their single I Can't Explain, which ends up kind of becoming a hit. Doesn't happen right away, but they appear on this program called Ready Steady Go, which is like show like aimed directly at mods. And that performance plus their, you know, of their underground cred leads the single to gain some momentum, reaches number 8 on the UK charts. They record another single called Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere. Kind of another hit. This song is actually more loud and distorted and noisy. And apparently, when they originally sent the demo over, or not the demo, the fully recorded song to American Decca for release, they wrote back and said, "You sent us the wrong track. This has got all this noise on it." And they're like, "No, that's like actually what this is supposed to sound like." And now this is another one of those like Kurt Cobain's top 10 albums type of shit. Like a lot of people say this is the first use of feedback as an instrument on a single. I actually can kind of buy it because something like I Feel Fine by the Beatles, it's like a second of feedback and then the song starts. This is like feedback incorporated into the song as a part of the song. And that's the kind of stuff that I like by the Who. It's fucking raw. It's like, you know, there's a lot of crackling energy to it. Anyway, they got some success. The band is kind of starting to hate each other at this point. Like Entwistle and Moon are really cool, but it sounds like for Daltrey and Townsend, this is just like purely a business relationship. They're not friends. And add to that the fact that the band had traditionally been run by Daltrey, but more and more Townsend is taking over the writing of the songs and creative control of the band. And there was a real possibility that they were not going to make it to record their debut full length album. Apparently, Lambert and Stamp seriously considered firing Daltrey during this period, but they thought that he was like enough of a contributor to the image that they would have to keep him around. So we're going to jump through some of this stuff relatively quickly. Now, November 65, they released the single My Generation. Big step forward for the Who, includes a bass solo of all things, and is still a hit. That is then followed up by the full-length album My Generation in December 65, also a hit. They have the single off of there, The Kids Are All Right. Hits number 5 on the UK album charts. Doesn't chart in the US, but it does go gold in the UK, selling 100,000 copies. Pretty damn good debut. 1966, they followed up with a quick one. Hits number 4 on the UK charts, number 67 on the US charts. I can't find any certifications for it, so I don't know if it went silver or gold or whatever. 2 albums, pretty respectable showing, and a tried and true method of writing accessible, catchy pop music with a lot of bombast and attitude. And
so they were writing from before My Generation. Was Pete in control as like the principal composer and songwriter
For the album My Generation, he basically writes the entire album.
Okay.
Then for the follow-up, A Quick One, it's actually primarily written by other members of the band. Townsend contributes 4 of the 10 tracks as a writer. But then follow up the next album, The Who Sell Out, and
But also it should be mentioned, A Quick One has their very first taste of conceptual music, because A Quick One is a suite that is basically a concept song that then is then blown up into these, crazy double albums.
yes, so they will get into some excessive album lengths coming up, but their next album, The Who Sell Out, Townsend takes back writing responsibility, pens 9 of the 13 tracks. And I was not aware of this album before, but it's like a pretty cheeky album.
I love it. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like the reference to real world products with like quasi jingles and shit interspersed between songs actually got them in some trouble. They got sued by the people, the actual products that they were like representing in there. But it does okay. But Townsend is basically in a mindset that for all of his previous albums, he'd been focused on writing for the audience, which was mostly mods. And then he decided that he wanted to write an album for himself, and that becomes Tommy. So he basically says he had taken LSD a couple of times and he really didn't like it, but it was super popular with their fans. And he felt like he wanted to try to write songs that captured part of that culture. And the part that he chose to focus on was the mysticism side of things. Apparently, what had happened, and this is relevant for Lifehouse, he had kind of flippantly declared that he was going to write a rock opera and sort of didn't realize all that was going to be involved in pulling off a project of that scope. But Kit Lambert was the one who was like, no, that's a great idea. He was like the project manager. He was like, let's go through all the steps of how we can actually get a rock opera put together, and really help to shepherd that product across the finish line. And actually, Robert Daltrey said that Lambert and Smart were like the fifth and sixth members of the band. Like they were instrumental to getting the band to actually accomplish anything. So they released Tommy, huge hit. Gold in the UK, 100,000 copies sold. Goes double platinum in the US with 2 million sold. They tour extensively on Tommy. There's a bunch of other adaptations, eventually a film. And basically it makes Pete Townsend a shitload of money because he writes it all. Doesn't really make the rest of the guys a shitload of money, but, it gets their name out there. And they've released Tommy. It's this grand concept album about a deaf, dumb, and blind pinball wizard. And Pete is aware
I mean,
that...
the concept was just sitting there, guys.
Of course.
Yes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Tale as old as time, Rob. But Pete Townsend basically said that he wanted to take this concept of deaf, dumb, and blind and incorporate it into his next project, which is this concept of Lifehouse. It's a sci-fi epic focusing on a time in the future where rock and roll is outlawed and people are being spoon-fed all of their entertainment and information from powerful interests. It's supposed to say that people are, instead of literally being deaf, dumb, and blind, they're blinded to the realities of the world. They're only parroting what is told to them by the elite. They're unable to think for themselves. I really wonder what that would be like. Like, what would it be like to live in a time where that was the reality?
They just fucking smash their instruments at the end of every show, even though it makes no sense.
So to say that this project sprawled would be an understatement. I mean, Townsend was envisioning a scenario where they would take up residence at the Young Vic Theatre in London to work out new material on stage in front of the audience, who would be encouraged to come onto the stage and participate in the songs. He also had a vision where every person who attended the show would have a personal profile compiled, and that from their astrological chart to their physical appearance, hobbies, all these characteristics would then be fed into a computer at the same moment, leading to one musical note culminating in mass nirvana that Townsend dubbed a kind of celestial cacophony. And he didn't like acid. This is what I don't understand.
Right,
This is the most acid statement I've ever heard in my life.
But he loved computers 20 years before they were invented.
I mean, he's talking about the algorithm, right? He's talking about like we're going to get the algorithm. Everybody's personal interests are going to be fed in there, and we're going to find something that's going to appeal to all of them.
Hold on, to be clear, it was going to be distilled down to a single note or some cacophony of different notes.
Listen,
I believe it's a single note. It's a single note.
I see.
it's like the ohm.
One of
You know.
yeah, one of 10 or whatever.
And then, like very prominently in Lifehouse, there is, a vision of what would become the internet and what would become virtual reality. And I think this is my theory is that this is where he started getting tripped up on details. I think the details of this thing wound up swallowing Pete whole, and he was never able to really connect the whole thing together.
Yeah. Well, and part of the problem was that Kit Lambert, who everybody always said that Kit was the only person who could give Pete Townsend any criticism and he would actually listen. Kit Lambert had started taking hard drugs, number one. And number two, got pretty butthurt that Pete Townsend rejected his script for the Tommy movie. And then kind of was like going behind his back and dealing with the studio and cutting Kit Lambert out. And so he was pretty pissed and he moved to New York. And so he wasn't there to sort of project manage this even bigger epic, experience that Pete wanted to put together. And I think when like Pete's a great idea guy, and I think when it came down to trying to execute on that grand idea, they're just like you said, Dave, the details weren't there. Like, for example, the young Vic was like, what the fuck are you talking about? We have like an entire play season already booked. You can't just take up residence at our theater. That's just like that. Step one, physically impossible for you to do that. Step two, what do you mean you're going to compile dossiers of every single concert goer? And step three, they just want to hear you play My Generation and smash your shit on stage. They have no interest in hearing you work out new material over the course of a month.
Maybe he was trying to be the totalitarian cult leader, under the guise of researching it.
Maybe.
I think, and the thing about this concept that is so amazing to me is that it never struck me as a strong enough concept to have actually, what they did with Who's Next is, I think, far better than what Lifehouse would have been. But Lifehouse haunted him his entire career. He kept figuring out different iterations, using it in different ways throughout his entire career.
It's the
Solo
one that got
and with
away.
the Who. Yeah, exactly.
Well, in all honesty, I would agree with you. It sounds like what he intended Lifehouse to be was sort of like, the Styx concept album that they put together.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds kind of like that. It's a bit of a thin concept, and it sounds also pretty derivative because the hero of Lifehouse was supposed to be called Bobby. And that was going to be your follow-up from Tommy, is that the hero is Bobby. It's not fully fleshed out. So all these logistical problems are causing this project to really fall apart. And they're like, we do really need to go and actually put some stuff down. So they go and they record at the Rolling Stones house for their first session of what will become Who's Next, April of 1971. They get the backing track for Won't Get Fooled Again. Then they decide they're going to relocate to Olympic Studios in May of 1971. And that is where they record the rest of the album that will become Who's Next. And the sessions go extremely well. And again, I think a big part of it is the fact that they had Glyn Johns as their producer, and every other album had been produced by Kit Lambert, or like their manager was producing them. And that's not what you want. You want an absolute pro who knows all of the equipment. They would come out and be like, everything sounds so good. It's like, yeah, this guy knows how to record shit. He's one of the best to ever do it. And the guy from before was just a film student fucking his way through it and trying to figure out what the knobs do, basically.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So they were so impressed with Glyn Johns that not only did they allow him to convince them to
They
cut it down
smashed the
from
mixing
double
console after the record was done.
Right.
Exactly.
No, they didn't. They didn't.
Yeah. So no, they tell him, you know what? You're right. This shouldn't be a double album. This should just be a single album. And you can pick the songs that show up on the album and you can choose the order in which they appear.
What?
Yeah. That's
Damn.
kind of like an incredible amount of freedom to give up to a guy that you then thank by giving him an associate producer credit. Wah,
Right.
wah.
Damn.
Yeah. And Kit Lambert, Lambert and Stamp get executive producer credits, even though it sounds like Lambert was just doing hard drugs. And
I never heard of this
not
Glenn
involved.
Glenn Johns guy, but Jesus Christ,
You know,
he's
oh, dude,
on-
Glenn Johnson,
on
the fucking
everything.
man, right?
It's
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Neil Young, the band,
The
Billy
Beatles,
Preston-
dude.
Billy
He was the
Preston,
engineer in
Yeah,
Abbey
yeah.
Road.
Yeah.
Beatles, Procol
Yeah.
Harum. Damn, Steve
He
Miller
is-
band.
Unassailable. Well, maybe one.
He's responsible for Abracadabra. What the?
So we're basically at the release of this album. You know, they put together the full length album. I just want to touch on some of the technology that they end up using here. They use the ARP synth on several tracks, as well as this like Lambert organ, which I think is actually used together in like really great effect. You can kind of hear the ARP and the Lambert kind of playing off of each other, and they use it to sort of sequence it and give it this like interesting sound. And they use the VCS3, which is another analog synth. And I agree, Rob, that this is kind of a bit of ahead of its time when it comes to the application and the use of synth and incorporating it into the sort of organic sound of a rock band in this way. And so I'll give a lot of credit to Pete Townsend for that. Even though I personally don't feel like I like Pete Townsend all that much, I think that he really did know how to blend that synth in. And maybe it was
Yeah.
Glenn Johns who was like, here's how you make them all sound harmonious together.
I
But-
think those create the best moments on the record. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you guys want to talk about the record? You guys want to actually dive into some tracks here?
I
do it,
don't,
baby.
I don't think we need to.
Yeah. Yeah. We've already covered it enough. We're just going to vote no and go home. Okay, great.